Everyone, and welcome to UCL. Welcome to the Bartlett. And thank you for joining us for this for today's event, exploring the potential move from sustainability to regeneration. My name is Yair Schwartz. I am a lecturer here at the Bartlett at the Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering, and I lead the research group for life cycle analysis and circular economy, themes that are directly related to the theme we are going to talk about today. Today's event asks a very important and simple question. Is the built environment okay with measuring and reducing the environmental impacts of our developments, or should it, or can it, expand and look at regeneration and enhancing environments? And to explore this question, we are happy to host a number of experts from both from academia and from practice. Each of the speakers will present their view on the topic. After that, we'll invite them all for a panel discussion. We'll have some Q&A from you guys. And in the end, we will invite you all to join us for some drinks and nibbles and networking at the back. Today's event is also part of the UCL200 celebration, 200th birthday celebration. UCL hosts a series of panels and events across the campus, and this is one of the events, and we are very pleased to have the Bartlett Dean, Professor Jackie Glass, with us here today to have a few words. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Yair. Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you here. You are the hardcore. You came through the tube strike. Congratulations for being here. It's lovely to see you. So I'm very happy to be here this afternoon just to say a few words of welcome. Come on in, guys. So I'm Jackie Glass. I'm the Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, and I'm sure many of you know the faculty very, very well. But the fact that the Bartlett exists and the way in which we work enables us to host these kinds of events, because the things that we are known for are our interdisciplinarity, our innovation, our absolute commitment to excellence. But also, and this means a lot to me because I've always worked in partnership with industry, and I've worked with industry in practice as well, is we work cooperatively with many disciplines, and we work cooperatively with practice and industry and government. And that enables us to have those really challenging conversations. It means we can push forward and really contribute to some of the really difficult challenges and we really need to tackle today. So thank you, ID colleagues, for organising this afternoon's event. You're absolutely right. This is our 200th anniversary year at UCL, and we're celebrating it in lots of different ways through the year. And it means a lot to us to celebrate this moment, because 200 years ago we were founded as a university on the principles of essentially access for all. We were the first university to admit women on equal terms as men. And we were the first university to welcome people of all faiths and none. And so that inclusion and that welcoming aspect of what we do is very much here with us today at UCL as well. So regenerative design then, within the title of your event this afternoon, regeneration, this is a really important moment. And I know lots of colleagues here will be really interested to really explore around what we mean by regenerative design. And when I think about it, and I come from a sort of an architecture and materials and sustainability background, and I'm always thinking about what can we do better, what can we improve, what can we do to not harm, what can we do to prevent detriment. And so we have to keep challenging ourselves, though, because isn't it so easy to just do what we did before? Isn't it so easy to just follow along with the rules without challenging them? And so we have to keep pushing. So I'm hoping this afternoon that you can all give each other motivation to keep pushing, actually. For me, this is also, and I love, actually, do you know what the best part of is? That question mark, actually. I kept thinking about that question mark, because it's asking us a question. It's asking us, okay, do we need to rethink practice? Do we need to rethink practices? Do we need to rethink the way that we frame our disciplines and our knowledge bases? So that question mark is doing a lot of heavy lifting this afternoon. And I know the speakers will be I'm sure they'll be asking you some very difficult questions. But we need to take that time, and that's why I'm really grateful to colleagues for creating the space so that you can have this really good conversation this afternoon. I hope it is creative, I hope it is constructive, but above all, I hope it's enjoyable. And I hope you go away with some new inspiration. So enjoy your afternoon. I'm sorry I can't stay with you to enjoy the presentations, but Yair, Marcella, thank you so much for organising, and I'll hand back to you now, Yair. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Jackie Glass, for this lovely introduction. I'd like to invite Professor Marcella Ucci, Director of IEDE.
Hello, welcome. So I see that we've picked up numbers, and that's lovely to see. So Jackie said, I hope it's going to be enjoyable. Well, I know it's going to be enjoyable. So today is actually not only an event, it's the start of a conversation. So I'd like us to, all engage with what the speakers are saying, with the panel debate, and then help us really understand where we're going forward, right? So my task now is to say a few words about the UCL Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering, otherwise known as IEDE, so you will hear IEDE from now on. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm a professor in health and sustainable buildings, and I'm director of IEDE as of November 2025. I've been a program lead of an MSc called Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings, and a number of things. My research specifically is about how buildings should be designed, upgraded and operated in order to support health and well-being, reduce environmental impacts, so that's not in line with regeneration, and tackle inequalities. IEDE at a glance. So we are an institute within BESIR, the Bartlett School of Energy, Environment and Resources. Did I say that right? And Professor Neil Strachan is here, who is the head of the department. We have three other institutes in BESIR. We are very much and we aim to be transdisciplinary. A lot of our staff and students have a diverse range of academic backgrounds, from architects, engineers, physicists, anthropologists, so on and so forth. And so we pursue an inter and transdisciplinary understanding of the built environment with a focus on health, well-being and sustainability. And of course, we are part of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment, which I should say has been ranked first in the world worldwide in the topic of architecture and built environment studies, and also world leading for research power in the built environment according to REF 2021. These figures are not completely up to date. There is a little bit of changes here, but in IEDE we have about 60 academics and researchers, 10 honorary academics, about 50 doctoral students. I mean, of course, some have just started and others are about to complete. Up to 120 students with some variations across the year, and up to 300 undergraduate students. So we have 4 teaching programs and at postgraduate level, and you will see that all of them are to some degree relevant to the topic of regenerative design. So our 2 long-established programs, Environmental Design and Engineering and Light and Lighting, and I should say I did the MSc Environmental Design Engineering at the Bartlett. I completed in 2003. I don't know if I'm proud or ashamed to say that. We then launched in 2017 the Health, Wellbeing and Sustainable Buildings MSc, of which I was program lead for 2 years, and then 1 year later the Smart Buildings and Digital Engineering MSc. And these are all accredited by CIBSE, which is the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. I believe that Environmental Design Engineering and Light and Lighting are accredited by the Energy Institute. I'm looking at colleague, is that correct? So only ED, sorry, only Environmental Design Engineering. We also have undergraduate programs. So we have had a very long history of postgraduate teaching, slightly less about undergraduate teaching. We have now an established collaboration with architecture and civil engineering for a program, an MNG program, which is accredited across the 3 disciplines, which is quite a feat and an undertaking. We should be really proud of that. And we also launched a new undergraduate program, Sustainable Built Environment, Energy and Resources, which is in its 3rd year now. We are a center of excellence in the built environment. Example of these are a number of grants that we won that would typically be awarded as kind of world-leading groups, including more recently on the topic of health co-benefits of the transition to net zero. We have a number of kind of research clusters. Some of them are related to environmental quality, mostly indoor, but some outdoor as well. So light and lighting, acoustics and soundscape, moisture, temperature and air quality. Then a broader one on climate change, sustainability and cities, smart buildings and digital engineering, life cycle assessment, circular economy, energy use, retrofit and net zero, and systems thinking and transdisciplinarity. So hopefully you can see that some of them are perhaps very specific, other broad. We specialize in a number of research methods, including quantitative and qualitative, measurements, modeling, data analytics, and systems dynamics, for example. And last year we celebrated 60 years of environmental design and engineering at the Bartlett. Amongst other things, we launched a book, so there is a QR code there for if you want to have a look at the digital version of the book. And we also had an event, and both the events and the books were an opportunity to reflect on the meaning, that our trajectory in the field of environmental design and engineering, as well as where we're heading. So, I was thinking our institute is called Environmental Design and Engineering, and today we're talking about regenerative design. And is there a relationship between the two? Of course, the term itself, environmental design engineering, has a dual focus. On one hand, we're trying to minimize the impact on the environment, and at the same time, we are supporting people's health, well-being, and productivity through environmental factors. So it very much resonates with topics such as people and planet, planetary health. The question now is about, okay, what about regenerative ethos? I mean, certainly when I trained in the MSc Environmental Design Engineering in 2003, and still now I feel there's a lot of focus on, for example, efficiency, right? Energy efficiency was a buzzword back then. And in this sense, it's not about regenerative, right? It's about doing as little harm as you can. So in some ways today, we're going to understand, do we have to shift our mindset? Yeah. And if so, how do we do so? I know that, for example, at Future Build, regenerative design was, I think it was a buzzword that came up quite a lot. And I heard the colleagues saying, some people say it's not very well defined, and that's a problem, and other things is too well defined, that's also a problem. And what we're doing today is challenging our respective views of what regenerative designs may or may not mean. How should we measure it? What value does it have? And then at the back of my head, I will also be thinking, well, I don't know, is it time to change the name of our institute? I see Neil screaming. No, but let's see. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Yair.
Thank you very much, Marcella. I think it was Brenda who just asked me before we started, what are we trying to achieve? And I think, personally, I mean, in a selfish way, I just want to understand more deeply what regenerative design means, and is it the next thing that we should be focused on? So I reflect on what Marcella just said. So without further ado, I would like to start the main event for today and invite our first speaker, Kathryn Firth. Kathryn is an architect and urban designer with over 30 years experience shaping thriving places, from public realm projects to large-scale regeneration. She's a former director at Arup, where she continues to consult, a former chief of design at the London Legacy Development Corporation. She sits on and chairs several design review panels, and she's active across the Urban Land Institute, the London Society, and Architects Declare. She also teaches at the Bartlett and at Central St. Martin. Sorry, Kathryn, thank you very much. doesn't sound like it's
not doing anything.
doing
I don't know what else to do. It has a green light on. So,
You can hear. Okay.
okay, good. Excellent.
So just a reminder, we have roughly 10 minutes, but we will not be too strict with.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I mean, I think it's obviously an incredibly important topic that I'm assuming everyone in the room is probably quite passionate about. And I think we're all kind of in the same situation of trying to understand what regenerative design really is. To that end, I've gotten involved in something called Architects Declare, UK Architects Declare. I'm sure some of you have heard of this group. It's exactly what it says on the tin. It's, you know, architects and urban designers and landscape architects who are really concerned about, you know, where we're heading and felt kind of need to come together. And what I'm going to share with you today is actually a kind of sneak preview of a primer, which is the Regenerative Design Primer, which we hope we will be publishing and launching in the next month or two. We've gone through what you're seeing is I guess, a bit of a draft. We've just gone out to many notable people who we think know a lot about regenerative design to make sure that we're capturing what we should be capturing. So just very quickly, as I was saying, Architects Declare is a network of architectural practices across the UK, committed to addressing climate and biodiversity issues and the emergency, answering the emergency. It goes back to 2019. This is, I'm sure you can all read, our vision, a built environment planned, constructed, and operated within planetary boundaries to deliver environmental justice and to support the flourishing of life for all time. So again, as others have said, starting with the Dean, this is a moment to be upping our game and to be changing benchmarks. And so what Architects Declare does is not just this primer that I'm sharing with you, but tries to find different ways to embed regenerative design across practice. But of course, part of that is making sure that everybody knows what that is. So this primer is a tool towards that end. We also had people raising the issue of well, we already have sustainable design, so what's the difference between sustainable design and regenerative design? And of course, we always get into this unfortunate situation where these become buzzwords. And so, you know, everything's sustainable, your shoelaces, the doorknob, you name it. And now everything can be regenerative. But do we really know what that means? And I think, you know, we have the responsibility, and I say that, you know, for everybody in the room who's involved in the built environment, to kind of have that be something that can be defined meaningfully. So the way we think about it at Architects Declare is that, you know, we have a kind of foundation of sustainability, but we need to think one beyond that with regenerative design. We need to shift the focus from reducing harm to actually creating positive impact, from human-centric to all of life-centered thinking. So we're not the only ones who are living on the planet and need to and want that longevity. And then from carbon-focused to systemic approaches, which doesn't mean that we stop thinking about, you know, carbon emissions and our responsibility to get down to net zero. We still need to be thinking about what metrics and targets we use, and I'm going to come back to that later because I think there are many ways that we talk about how we will meet these goals, and I think that's something, I don't know if we'll be able to bottom it out this afternoon, maybe the other speakers have the answer, but it's something we're certainly grappling with. So I think we all know what it says in red here, that, you know, the state of our built environment right now, it's not great news. We are exceeding planetary limits. We're harming life that's, you know, in the water, on the land, and we need to move beyond and think about a regenerative model. So this is, you know, a sort of funny diagram here that talks about, you know, what the evolution is versus devolution, and that we need to be restorative, reconciliatory, regenerative, and not do what's on the below the bar here. Not just think about sustainability, that's a good start, not greenwash, and go beyond conventional practice. So it really is very much about raising ambition. We have a set of guiding principles, which we call the regenerative framework. It's about, it's a sort of tripartite system with place in the center, because frankly, if we can, we can talk up here and sort of float around with great language endlessly, but everything lands and has an impact on the ground, and it's what we are living and breathing. So first is to be a good ancestor. So we need to think in the long term. We have to design for adaptability and think across 7 generations. I'm sure you've heard of that sort of generational thinking before, which means being innovative and future ready, which is a tough call in a funny way, because none of us has a crystal ball. We can't read the future. So part of that is building in adaptation. We need to co-evolve with nature. So thinking that humans are part of living systems, and so we need to be thinking about how we can restore those ecosystems. And then create a just space for people. So that's very much about, we talk a lot about social value now. We want to promote social connection, equity, and well-being. This has been a bit of a journey for us. There was a version 1. This is now going to be, the version 2, if you like. And it's all about making the principles of regenerative design accessible. So communication becomes really important. Architects always get blamed for talking, a kind of archy language amongst themselves. This is really about communicating to a very broad audience, and then providing a set of tools for implementation and making sure that people can have sort of tangible references that they can refer to and use to inform their own work. So this is kind of our approach, which we call Meet Them Where They Are, which is about having a shared language and about making sure that we are speaking the language of those people that we want to make change, whether that's developers or people in local authorities or different companies who are not necessarily, thinking, it's not at the top of their agenda right now to think about regenerative design. So we need to put things into their language so that they will embrace it. So, and understand what drives individuals and stakeholders. So we did a lot of kind of stakeholder interaction, engagement to get to this place, to determine what drives stakeholders. And I mean, one can never be comprehensive. Everybody's going to have a different agenda. But we need to ask key questions from the beginning. Who's the end user? Is the project dependent on cost and time? That's cost and time. We all know how much that drives things. Does the business model involve a sale or lease of the asset, whether it's a building or it can even be, a larger site for a master plan? And is adding value a priority? And if not, what do we do about that? Are decisions only made on cost right now? And is the stakeholder likely to take risks? We, of course, want to encourage maybe what might be seen as risk, and even how people define risk is going to be different depending on who you're talking to. So, this is just a little on the right-hand side. Here is just a kind of table of what those questions are that we need to be able to come up with that. So remember, what I'm sharing with you is the primer. So this is, how one might talk to a client. And then again, part of that involved categorizations from each question that indicate which category the stakeholder fits into. Now, we don't want to put anybody in a box, but at the same time, we need to start to create this understanding so we know who we're talking to. So if you're talking to a commercially driven stakeholder who is only thinking about the short term, what can you do then to appeal to them when you're working with them? They're going to have different drivers, and a different agenda from someone who might be value driven or risk averse. Or one stakeholder might be everything all wrapped up in one there, which becomes even more of a challenge. So we started to think about, the sort of ubiquitous KPIs, which we thought were actually perhaps rather narrow when one thinks about performance indicators. And so we changed it to value indicators. And again, if anyone has a fabulous way of sort of setting things out, metrics out and targets out, that doesn't then result in people wanting to do the least onerous, please do share it with me, because we struggled with this quite a bit, to be honest. So the very simplest level, it's, I don't care, I do care, but, I'm not sure how much I want to kind of step out of what I normally do, or I really care, so tell me what I can do. And so this was really, to help set a brief. And then what we did was we got far more granular. Again, the wheel's a little bit of a work in progress, and I think we have, this is the age of wheels, and we've kind of probably, got wheels coming out of our ears with every report you pick up. But what we started to look at was, under those three big principles of being a good ancestor, co-evolving with nature, and creating a just space for people, what are the elements that make up that a built environment, and how can people then be regenerative within those? And so if you think of this wheel as, this is kind of the I don't care, or you're just not performing very well, all the way out to being ambitious. So somehow the hope is that people will be more ambitious, because people want to be, in the green and be seen as doing the right thing. Just a couple of quick case studies, and then I will finish, because I know in time. The first case study is actually something that was done at Arup a little bit before the primer was created, but I think it's a good illustration. I, of course, as an urban designer, am very keen on looking at the urban scale. I think it's, the spaces between the buildings need to be regenerative as much as the buildings need to be regenerative. So in this case, we were very lucky. Latimer was very progressive in their thinking. Arup engineers and people who are concerned with urban agriculture are working with Howard Tompkins. So it was very much about creating a design brief, working to a design brief that embedded 4 key principles that you can see down the side here from the 3 we have, but then circular resource was one at that point, which was taken out, which is separate, which is now embedded in R3. But what we set up with, similar to what I was talking about with value indicators, which were sort of stretch targets. How can we set targets that will really push the ambition up? And so this resulted in some, 83 different targets, and I'll be happy to know I'm not going to go through all of those. But what we did, and this is really just explaining a process, because I think every project is going to be different, but we need to give people an example, is per project stage indicate what the focus needs to be. So for example, master planning and this impactful stretch target in red, or is it going to be a green or blue, i.e. less ambitious, and some targets will be more relevant at some stages than others. So I'm aware that I've probably gone over the time, so I'm not going to take you through this except to just show you an example. This is an individual building, and you can just see here, how, in a way, it's like one of the, it gets called a spider drawing, that starts to indicate, how performance and measure performance. Because I think we live in a world, sadly, that people need tangible outcomes and tangible results, and unless we do that, we're not going to be able to see how this works. So just really quickly, regenerative design is a mindset. You need to set a vision clearly from the beginning that balances value with the stretch goals, and value in all senses of the word, to get the right kind of team for a long-term regenerative impact, and then go for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. I think it's excellent. It's really good to see that you guys have developed a framework which is a bit more tangible and kind of frames the whole. It's easier to frame the discussion around. So that's a really great start. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Malina Dabrowska. Did I pronounce it correctly? Thank you. Malina is a designer, strategist, and senior consultant in Arup's global foresting team, working at the intersection of futures, the built environment, policy making, and design. Malina's work explores the relationship between nature and the built world, using design futures to reimagine more regenerative spaces for generations to come. Before joining Arup, Malina's design and architectural practice focused on designing spatial experiences and interactions. Malina, thank you.
Great, thank you. It's nice to be back in my home university, the Bartlett, where I've spent a long time. So great to follow on from Kathryn's presentation, because mine sort of zooms out a little bit and thinks about regenerative futures and thinks about our relationship with the built world from both the perspective of today, but also looking forward. And I want to start with a context. And our context is this photo that was taken through the latest Artemis mission. And what I'm always struck with and remember when looking at pictures of the planet is the overview effect. So this profound cognitive shift that is reported by the astronauts going into space and being in awe of the planet's fragility and unity. And this is our collective home and a starting point. And I think that's an important kind of anchor to thinking about regenerative design, because suddenly we see our planet from the outside as this system. And it's a system that, in kind of urban design terms, we have long perpetuated this distinction, or even a juxtaposition between the built environment and the natural environment, as though they're separate entities. And our sort of obsession with creating new things and slightly too uniform things and efficiency that was mentioned earlier, I think often erases the cultural fabric and the natural capital that comes with it. And the places are shaped to support, of course, our economic activity and to provide spaces for humanity to exist and thrive, but too often that comes at the expense of nature. And a project like the Rwandan Institute for Conservation of Agriculture, the land pressure, deforestation and degradation of soils and climate change were creating food shortages in Rwanda, and one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. With a population set to double by 2050, and with 80% of the population reliant on agriculture for their livelihood, there is a pressing need to adopt more sustainable agriculture and construction techniques. So Arup and Mass Design Group collaborated to design and construct this space, this place, as an educational facility that embodies that mission, and in its form, materials and operation. And this project is important to kind of set the context, because the context that was mentioned by Kathryn and often mentioned when it comes to regenerative design are the planetary boundaries. So something that was defined by the Stockholm Resilience Center researchers as sort of safe operating space for us, and that is for the construction industry very tied to carbon, but also very tied to kind of all of the resources that we tend to think of within the construction industry. And this sort of inequality with which we treat materials, I think, is represented really well in this diagram, which shows an 85% decline in wild terrestrial mammal biomass since the rise of humans. We're now at this really unique point in time where people are starting to understand the complexity of Earth systems and of our cities, and how significant of a geopolitical force humans have become. But we are, I think, woefully underprepared to deal with it. And I think that's where perhaps the ideas around regenerative design, to the earlier point of being too academic and too complex or oversimplifying some of these issues, maybe come into force. But we're slowly shifting our thinking. And I often think that a sort of an exercise in imagining a model where urbanization does not begin with a network of roads or nodes of economic activity, where shopping malls and transport hubs are built, or central business districts, real estate, etc. But instead we begin with thinking about the so-called ologies, the geology, the topography, the hydrology, or the ecology, and those are our starting points to the site or to the design process itself. So without the sort of endless definition wheel of what regenerative design is, I often start with my working definition of a regenerative design. And I won't read it out now, but this is just to highlight that I think the regenerative practice requires many definitions, and to the point of the transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach, I think we all as practitioners should sort of look to developing our own regenerative design definition that really applies to our field, to the place that we're designing in, and the purpose that that particular design is aiming towards. So looking to what regenerative design is trying to do, we're trying to create places which not only reinforce the living systems within nature, but also try and place humans as part of nature. And so the regenerative outcomes in this case are where both humans and non-humans, or nature, are the key stakeholder and co-creator, and we're able to continuously see renewal and replenishment within these systems. So in practice, that requires a place-based approach that's built on understanding of our local conditions. And the regenerative approach does not seek to create this pre-development ecosystem, but rather understands how can we create new systems within what we have already built. So at Arup, we try to define these three principles because it's really difficult to start a conversation about regenerative design without having anchor points. And these are not perfect by any means, but the rough three buckets that we believe have value in placing different ideas around how to start to describe regenerative design are nature-led, systemic, and equitable. And those principles can be a starting point, or like I said, an anchor to describing projects or interventions in that way. So the nature-led is a regenerative, where regenerative design lets nature shape the human-built forms and integrate with them, leveraging ecosystem functions and processes, enables humans to live in harmony with natural cycles, and therefore ensures resilience through planetary health. So the second one, the systemic, this is all about relationships. This is all about exchanges and flows of materials and helping resources that are kind of continually restoring and circulate within the systems, and which are protected and replenish over time. The third principle is calling more towards the 7 generations, or the kind of the principle that I think most, in my experience, most practitioners in the built environment industry struggle to define within the projects clearly. And they often perhaps are an afterthought. But regenerative design places equitable outcomes right at the heart of what regenerative design should be doing. And this is all about designing the regenerative design guiding us to nurture a just space and a biosphere that supports us all, maximizing harmony and justice through equitable nature, climate, and social targets, and ensuring human health and well-being. And in that, there's examples of work where nature-led, so valuing capital and driving positive outcomes, can be described in a bit kind of through a bit more of a tangible lens. So in this case, we're looking at a project in Singapore that monitored the tree health, and I'm calling out the nature-led principle here because the idea with this project was that we, through monitoring the health of the ecosystem, the local ecosystem, through automation, satellite imagery, and machine learning, we're effectively bringing nature into something that should be equally valued on par with any part of the infrastructure, like a road might be. Equally thinking about the systemic principle, here I'm calling out a urban drainage system in Shanghai. This is an intervention that is in a city that's highly populated and faces major water-related challenges. And the design here, in sort of its core principle, says the urban system should be treated as a natural system and should be designed in such a way that the natural or the semi-natural landscape within the city, in combination with the grey water infrastructure, creates a regenerative ecosystem, so one that can help both humans and nature thrive. And finally, the equitable principle, so the collective change, the co-creation and collaboration that ensures inclusivity and social justice, calling back the RICA project in Rwanda. This is where the education and skills were really core part of the project. The Institute provided full scholarships to 84 students a year. It brought the agriculture through an internationally recognized program, but also created employment locally, and created, during its construction, 90% of the 2,500 workforce who were employed in the local area. And so parking the principles for a minute, that's always a bit of a kind of handful to go through these lectures, because it is not really just about the principles. It's fundamentally about changing a way in which you talk about the built environment, and changing the way in which we measure outcomes. So Kathryn talked about, do you care or you don't care? The kind of KPIs of care, I think, will stay with me. In here, we talk about how can we build from extractive built systems, how can we build systems where humans co-evolve as part of the Earth's living systems? Or how do we, rather than appropriating the resources and potentially going beyond our planetary boundaries, how can we responsibly recycle resources within our systems? And I think those questions can be illustrated in one way through creating a sort of shift from what a site might mean. So what if we considered construction sites more as regenerative systems? On the left, we have this global system which doesn't have a clear provenance of materials, nor a connection to communities or positive outcomes. But what if we were to shift to this more local way of treating our site, and perhaps more regenerative, because it clearly addresses local materials, culture, place, and economy? That's always a challenge when thinking about, can I get all of the materials that I need on my site within a 50, 100 kilometer radius? But what if that was just a sort of the first thought rather than the last thought when designing our places? Lastly, I really want to talk about regenerative futures, because that is where we often... Say again? Yep, this is the end. We think about regenerative futures because we often talk about going towards regenerative design, but what does that actually mean? In the Foresight team, we explored what the next 30 years look like through this projection, and describing the possible and future scenarios within the industry. We use data to map out policies, targets, tipping points, which help us understand the operating context and help us ask the right questions, but more importantly, to challenge our assumptions about what we should design and who we should be designing for. And this should ideally play. And so when our team uses this data to create narrative futures to help us ask the right questions, we try and really get to the bottom of what does a regenerative design mean within the context of future London in this example. The film explores what a climate conditions might occur in London in 2060, what modes of transport, what types of institutions might arise in that future, and what technologies we might use to support our work. And all of this is contextualized within already existing projects. So what's important about these visions or ideas around what possible futures might look like is we map existing projects or interventions and create a coherent narrative that places those existing solutions and ideas and say, and we sort of try and put together a thesis to say all of these interventions can be brought together into a real working system. Those exist already in our world today, and the question is more about joining the dots and creating those systems and weaving them together. And I'll cut to the last part of this, which is those tangible examples that I've shown you are a way for us to think about systems to help build narratives around what types of regenerative futures we want to build. And I believe that this is essential in rethinking the built environment, where it becomes a practice which is not just concerned with the living and thriving systems which are human-made, but also recognize that we are also part of nature, and starting to weave those existing regenerative interventions into a future story is where I think the built environment can really successfully start defining in practice what regenerative design is.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Malina. Yeah, I find it really great to see that we have some kind of targets or some frameworks, both in practice but also from architects declare. So that's really, it will be really interesting to see if we have time later on to see kind of the differences or the similarities in your approaches. So that's great. Thank you. Our next speaker, we are moving on now for the academic kind of speakers. So our next speaker is Dr. Brenda Parker. Brenda is an associate professor of sustainable bioprocesses design in UCL Department of Biochemical Engineering. Her interdisciplinary work brings together environmental biotechnology, bioprocesses engineering, and design. She co-founded the Biointegrated Design Lab with, excuse me, Biointegrated Design Lab with Professor Marcus Cruz, developing applications of living systems for the built environment. Her work has been exhibited internationally, including the Indus algae biocreator. I hope I said it correctly.
Don't worry, I'll tell them later.
And project at the St. Andrews Botanic Garden and Barking Riverside. Thank you, Brenda. I'll just pop your...
Okay, I think I've got mine here. Okay, thank you for the introduction. So today I want to talk a bit about something I've been thinking and writing about with my colleagues quite a lot, which is what does the next era of the Anthropocene look like? And we're calling that the Biocene. So what would it mean if we were to stop the kind of practices that we're engaging in and begin to basically design and work in a future that's much more ecologically mediated, where, as you can see here, we work with nature as a medium, not just a model or an inspiration. So Yair asked us to consider what our version of regenerative design would look like. And I had in my mind this beautiful diagram from Howard Odum's book. This is actually a study on Silver Springs in Florida. It's a simplification of the flows of energy and matter in one ecosystem. And if we think about what is a regenerative system to me, as someone who works with living organisms, it's one that feeds on the very abundant resources of sunlight and CO2. So for those of you who know me well, I'm the algae girl. I am the person who actually loves working with photosynthetic microorganisms. But that's not the only photosynthesis that exists. Of course, we have plants as well too. But what is really important when we begin to think about these systems, and maybe some of the mistakes we made before with things like biofuels, is we divorced the biological process from the ecological situation that it sits in. So that's not really what I'm going to advocate for today. It's quite the opposite. But when you do that, things get a lot more complicated. And you can't just simply maximize for one variable, which is economic. And I think that came up through both of the speakers already. And we enjoy a position as top carnivores here on the right-hand side. But I think what we see in this particular ecosystem is the amount of energy flow needs to shift actually quite dramatically away from us, and look at those cycles that happen. So Iris, who's sitting there, always says to me, the bioeconomy is the original circular economy, and I cannot agree more. So within our group and within the design studio that I also run with Marcus, Studio Bioscene, we build a number of projects. We try to examine our ethos through making work. So here you can see projects such as the Waste Age project that was exhibited at the Design Museum, looking at waste from the Tate and Lyle factory, and can that be reformulated into a regenerative material for architectural applications. Indus, a project conducted by one of our PhD students looking at cadmium uptake in wastewater and how we can activate the surfaces of our buildings to begin to improve our environment. And we've also been trying to work much more within the built environment itself, either through the installation of things like these bioreceptive panels that you see on the bottom left-hand side at the sort of private house in Scotland. We also have some down at a primary school in Vauxhall, looking at air quality and the microbiome, as well as speculative designs for houses and asking ourselves, what is the typology of the future? How do we design a house that is regenerative, that fully embeds these biointegrated systems? So to maybe explain a bit more about how we think and make our work is to really go through what is the biointegrated design ethos. So if you haven't seen me recently around, because I'm always in the British Library working on this book, which I'm told has to be out by the end of the year. But the idea is that we are trying to embed a number of different layers into the work that we do. We look at metabolism at the kind of organism level, but also at the systems level, the environment and space, the materiality, the technology that we use to deploy this, but also aesthetics, because this is often something that people maybe don't talk about as an angle, that a worthy design should be not necessarily have a certain type of aesthetic, but when you work with living systems, it certainly will have an aesthetic, and it will be very different to the one that you know. And it may be disappointing. Oren Katz famously said biodesign is the aesthetics of disappointment. So it doesn't always behave itself. But the important thing is that when you integrate biology, it means you give it full agency. So you don't instrumentalize it just to meet your own needs. So it's not merely a target, a carbon tick box. It has a life literally of its own. And fundamental to this is actually the role of time. We don't expect our buildings to look the same tomorrow as they did today, and they won't look the same in 10 years' time as they look now. And this fallacy of this ageless building is partially what is keeping us in the destructive cycle that we're currently in. So I want to talk to you first about materials. This is a filamentous cyanobacterial called Camptonema animale. And our recent graduate, PhD graduate, Prantar Tamuli, developed this material during his time with us in the Biointegrated Design Programme. And what Prantar did was he was using this parameter of light to tune the properties of the material. So the cyanobacteria grow through this silica aggregate. And you're able to change and direct how they grow by altering the wavelength and intensity of light. And light is a wonderful substance to work with because it creates no waste. I see Edward over there. He knows very well that that is true. But the material that we were able to create is regenerative because at the end of the day, we can disassociate it, we can disassemble it, and we can return it back to its biological origins, or we can remake it. The material is also regenerative because we can break a bit off, we can reculture the system, and we can then engage in self-repair. So the idea of working in this way is also to engage with tools and technologies. So it is a form of craft, if you like, and the material does have a really beautiful appearance. And we were really fortunate to have the support of St Andrew's Botanic Garden to build this pavilion, where we installed several panels of the material, and we were able to leave them there for months on end. So a botanic garden for us is a wonderful place, much better than a museum, because it's actually a living space where people interact with living systems. And what was great is by creating this semi-permeable structure, we could look at how the material responded not only to the interaction of humans, but also to the interaction of climate. I also believe, when I'm invited to talk about regenerative systems, if we don't talk about soil, we're also missing out a very fundamental point. We were invited by Periscope and a number of other people to engage in a project looking at a brownfield site at Barking Riverside. Barking Riverside is, I think, Europe's largest brownfield development. It's built on the site of a former gasworks and a rubbish dump. So it has a huge anthropogenic legacy of hydrocarbons and other heavy metals and basically everything that we've been doing over the last sort of period of the industrial revolution on the Thames. This parcel of land by the river was going to be the last to be developed. So it's one of the more valuable parts of the site. So we knew it was going to be lying there for a number of years. And the brief that we created for ourselves is what is the minimum we could bring to a site to be able to activate it. So we came up with this concept of these sort of almost biodegradable planters, if you like, made from impact-printed soils. It's taking a vernacular technique of rammed earth, bringing together computational design and robotics, and looking at, in future, perhaps even a site where humans could not go. What could we do to activate this? So Kenneth and a number of others worked on this project creating these impact-printed, if you like, bullets. And we combined this with lab research, looking at what if we embedded beneficial bacteria into these bullets, and as they degraded and as they biodegraded on the site, they would release these bacteria that were able to degrade hydrocarbons. So long story short, we installed the planters on site. It's not always the easiest place to work, Barking Riverside. And we were able to monitor them over a period of months and establish just how the structure was weathering and degrading. It actually held up for a surprisingly long time. And what was wonderful, it wasn't just about the plants that we were trying to plant on this incredibly arid and quite hostile site, but also the invertebrates and other creatures that began to inhabit the structure, which was really wonderful. And over time, of course, it was returned back into the earth. So the final aspect I would like to talk a bit about is cycles of water. So this also comes up in the Earth's planetary boundaries conversation. How do we design within our architecture or in our built environment to embed perhaps biological activation of our surfaces that can do some of this work with us and for us? So we have a number of lines of research in our lab, including sort of bioreceptivity, looking at the innate properties of a material to support life, and bioremediation, which is really the application, if you like, of living systems to remediate pollution. And we begin to wonder, what if we brought these two areas together? What would that look like, and how would it be? We made a design demonstrator. This is actually for a really wonderful exhibition we were invited to be part of by Jane Withers that she curated on water. And so this was exhibited over a number of months in Hamburg and then in Zurich, where we allowed water to run over the structure. It's a porous ceramic that we have 3D printed, or additively manufactured, using the robot from clay. And we were looking at how algae colonize the surface, and then matching this up with some of the research we're doing in the lab on remediation. And what is really interesting is the reaction of people. Of course, they find it quite fascinating. It's slimy and gooey. It's quite compelling. But this idea of having a time-based element in a public space to try and enable people to become familiar with some of these things. So we're bridging, I guess, high-tech and low-tech here to some extent. But also what we're trying to say is these things are unfamiliar, but the microbiome is actually such a quintessential part of our life and our ecosystem services that it's really interesting for you to encounter it in a space. And so that's really where I'd like to finish, with a bit of an invitation, maybe, for the future of regenerative design to really think about and include the microbiome. I think if you're in 2026 and you're not thinking and talking about the microbiome, then you have been left behind, my friends, because this dictates everything. Plant health, human health, how our nutrients are recycled. Yet we design as if we completely are unaware of it. And it's complicated, and that is probably why it's quite off-putting. So it's a bit of an exercise a few years ago. Harry and me and a number of others decided to map the REBA plan of works for landscape projects with the microbiome and show that it can be done. So I would love to work with anybody else who's thinking about REBA plan of works, which is not my world at all, I have to say. But it's fascinating when you start to bring in how this would start to be implemented. What might this mean in terms of the materials we choose? And what might this mean in terms of the vegetation that we pick? It's not merely colouring things in with plants, it is meaningfully trying to activate spaces with a microbiome that is actually, that has a role, if you like, in both plant and human health. So I just want to say thank you, because all of this work is done by a huge team, not huge, a team that's way beyond me anyway, let's face it. And if you want to come and see any of our work, the autumn show in September is the place to come next. We'll probably have an exhibit there for BioAD. And yeah, I just wanted to leave you with maybe one final thought. As I was reading this morning this report from the Global Justice Institute, I don't know if anyone saw that, it was in The Guardian today. I think it's Thomas Piketty and a number of others who put forward an alternative future. And I found it so exciting that a group were thinking about this beyond mere economics. And I find that a lot of our thinking is hampered when we just revert back to, well, is it cost effective? Can it be cost competitive with what we already do? The answer is already no, but the point is what we value has to be different. And I really believe that if we want to move into what I would call the bioscene, that value system is also the thing that has to change as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda, for a very inspiring talk. Quite different approach and scope to the previous month, but this is why we are here, so thank you for that. Our next speaker is Emily Loquidis. Emily is a director at KLH Sustainability and a PhD researcher here with us at UCL200. Emily is widely recognized for her work in sustainable design, with expertise in net zero carbon strategies, whole life carbon, circular economy, and emerging research in regenerative design. Emily, thank you.
I think this is fine, yeah. All right, thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, Yair. And as mentioned, I wear two hats at the moment. So today I'm going to take you through some of the research that I'm doing into regenerative design and how that maps back into some of my work then in industry. So we've seen iterations of this graphic already, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it is representative, I think, of a broad agreement in terms of what we're talking about with regenerative design and trying to move that conversation away from approaches that are conventional and green and sustainable and moving forward with something that is more restorative and regenerative. And so digging into this with my research and having to actually sit down and define what regenerative design is in order to study it, I think as many speakers have pointed out, it is a transdisciplinary topic and one that doesn't come with one simple definition. So once I began reviewing some of the academic literature, I was able to kind of identify broad categories that regenerative design kind of addresses. So topics such as circular economy, we heard from Brenda just now about bio-inspired design, and thinking about the actual products and bio-utilization and how that could be employed or used within the built environment. Kind of broader projects, and Malina hit on this a little bit as well, with blue and green infrastructure, and how we can use nature-based systems instead of built systems to service our infrastructure needs. Then kind of looking at environmental budgets and thinking about carrying capacity and some of the planetary limits work that we talked about, and thinking about ecosystem services and how we pull nature into the conversation with the built environment in terms of the functioning, literal functioning of an ecosystem, and then positioning our built environment projects within the context of nature and natural systems. In addition to that, I spent a lot of time looking at different frameworks, so both from the commercial sector as well as the academic sector. So I looked at things like the Living Building Challenge and Lenses framework, and then more specific pieces of work from academia, and also did kind of a broad case study review, which I'll breeze through in a second. That didn't quite drop down the way it should have. But anyway, so my research now is currently focusing on the relationship between the circular economy and regenerative design and the environmental budget element, so it should come down all the way to there. And looking at a very specific range of environmental indicators, so paying attention to energy, water, GHG emissions, waste and nutrient cycling, materials, and land use. And, you know, as mentioned, this is kind of one piece of the pie with regenerative design, and it certainly isn't the only, you know, valid interpretation. But my research is looking at how circular systems are supporting regenerative outcomes broadly. And so some of the case studies I began to look at, I started with a broader kind of exploration, looking at individual building projects. So a lot of them that have been certified with Living Building Challenge. You mentioned the Pay building earlier as one kind of an example. And looking at different projects kind of at the urban level that might integrate one aspect of it. And I focused it down to kind of urban level projects that have kind of circular elements or regenerative elements. So this is a project in Sweden. It's an older project and quite well studied, and it really highlights planned kind of circular infrastructure. So I kind of drilled everything down to 3 main case studies. This one builds on the Hammarby model, so it has a lot of planned regenerative elements, but I guess a more truer focus on regenerative design, and also features phytoremediation systems, so some of the work that Brenda talked about also into the design of this project. And then I wanted to contrast that with a well-performing urban development, kind of similar size, that didn't necessarily have a regenerative charter to start with, but still had a strong kind of focus on adaptive reuse and long-term materials circularity. So as part of my research then, I wanted to select one of the frameworks that I had kind of reviewed to see and focus on kind of the performance elements, what would happen if we looked at the pre-development metrics, so establishing kind of an environmental budget for the site and drilling down into the thematic pillars that I mentioned before. So I won't have time to go through each of, I think, the high-level conclusions, but the framework that I was looking at was one that was published in conjunction with a book that focused on ecosystems biomimicry in 2018. And in reviewing it, I think it was a good broad brush kind of indicator or scan of what we should look at to establish kind of a place-based regenerative baseline. But I felt like it was kind of missing some specifics in evaluating long-term circularity, particularly on the material side, and how we would establish value around residual value of materials or a material bank on a particular site. It also didn't get, super specific in terms of the individual elemental nutrient recovery opportunities, like phosphate cycle, for example. And I think same with the habitat. So the area, habitat area is used as kind of a proxy metric for ecological health. And The industry has progressed, I think, significantly since 2018, and we have BNG and all sorts of other indicators that are now better overall interpretation of ecological health. I also picked up from this, there's obviously kind of independent variables aside from the environmental impact categories, which is kind of what I was initially interested in, that would affect the performance of kind of the system. So things like population or density or how these solutions get placed kind of spatially, but I wasn't able to kind of capture that yet. And also kind of system or indicator dependencies. So if we were to close the water loop cycle by implementing or installing rainwater capture infrastructure, that would obviously increase the embodied carbon. And so this was kind of an early scoping study for me to inform my future work. So I'm only about 1.5 years done with my research. And the goal of that will be to kind of bring all of that into a more dynamic process where I can look at the different impact or thematic pillars, but also then consider the sensitive variables and kind of the spatial analysis issues, and then think about optimal configurations of that, and then looking at once those are decided, then which ones are kind of the best and the fittest in terms of climate change scenarios in the future. So, and then just to back up and talk a little bit about some of the work that I'm doing in industry. So a lot of my research is sitting kind of at the urban level, and with industry, or what I'm doing in my work, is trying to connect the planetary boundaries, which we've already talked about as kind of being a safe space for people to operate and live, and connecting that down at the product level and at the project level. So what we're doing is mapping those planetary boundaries to different EPD outputs. So environmental product declarations are associated with products that you would use to build a building. And we're testing this out on one project and plan to roll it out across a complete portfolio. So some of the preliminary observations that we had with this exercise is that it's, first of all, just difficult to define what good is. There's so much like carbon data available now, and there's benchmarks for carbon. So that's a much easier exercise in terms of identifying what good is. But with some of the other indicators, there isn't that same wealth of information yet to understand what good is. So I think just getting that data and interpreting it is one kind of exercise that we're undertaking. Also, just data availability with EPDs as a general issue, and we're also kind of questioning the definition process that sits behind the EPD indicators and wondering if they're representative, if they're the right indicators, and thinking about what might be kind of missing from that exercise. And I mean, we started with EPDs because that's what was kind of readily available to us in a commercial sense, but there's certainly other valid indicators and ways to potentially connect what's going on with the project to the planetary boundaries. And yeah, one of these kind of missing pieces, I think, is the site-based factors. So I'm hoping to pull in a lot of my research to then kind of connect what's going on with the planetary boundaries at a global level, drilling it down to the urban level, and then connecting it further down to the product and the specific project level. So, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think it was a really good, interesting example of how these principles are applied. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dewa Khan. Dewa is an architect whose work explores how design can draw inspiration from nature and create deeper meaning in the built environment. Born in Korea, educated in Princeton and Yale, and trained for 10 years with Zaha Hadid, he founded Dewa Khan Designs in 2014 with a focus on well-being, innovation, and beauty. His practice has received multiple RIBA awards, the Building Beauty Award, and recognition from the Korean Ministry of Land and Adaptive Reuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yair. Yeah, I'll use this. I think it sounds better. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Let me just get organized here. Yes, hello. I'm Daewak Kang. For the last 11 years, our practice has been exploring the interrelationship between nature, design, and regeneration. From direct experience of nature to the use of natural materials and forms to permanent architecture that evokes geology or other natural phenomena. We're on a continuing search for new forms, new meanings, and new ways to positively impact the world. So among our accomplished colleagues we've heard from, I come here as a designer and a builder, primarily, aiming to build regeneratively at all scales on occupied sites. I think others have addressed regeneration through the lens of carbon, through biology, through urban design. Today I'm going to focus on a narrow slice of our interest, but something that is very meaningful for me. And for me that includes the repair of meaning. So this idea of cultural regeneration. So my argument today is that meaning can be a currency in the regenerative economy. And I'll test that idea against 3 of our projects and try to keep it all within 10 minutes, which is always a big challenge. So our first use of the word regeneration in the practice came 10 years ago as a title of our project, the regeneration of St. Andrew Holborn. So Christopher Wren's largest parish church was firebombed in World War II, rebuilt with a limited budget in the 1960s. And as we embarked on the task, we searched for a word that would give us more direction and inspiration, this being one of our first adaptation projects. So regeneration as a title took us beyond the task of renovating or redesigning and brought us into the realm of a reimagining or a rebirth. So there were basic things to be done. The architects in the 1960s ran out of money, as I guess architects always do, unable to afford a stone floor. So they used vinyl Marley tiles contaminated with asbestos, which we had to deal with, of course. The color scheme, the lighting, and the decoration had taken on decades of clutter. None of Wren's drawings remained, but we discovered through a deep dive into historic records a much more uplifting atmosphere. So white and off-white colors, a stone floor. Our work prioritized the transformation over replacement, working with fewer resources and thinking about longer lifespan. I think no pressure, but the client said, well, you know, this stone floor, it's going to be there for 250 years, so you try and get it right if you can. Yeah, there was an opportunity to turn this cluttered chapel into a new baptistry. We discovered a spring under the church and were able to filter it using the water for ceremonies. It can still be used day to day. Roman artifacts were found near the spring, indicating that this may have been a spiritually significant site for more than 2,000 years. An additional layer of history was the baptismal font installed in the 1960s when Thomas Corum's Foundling Hospital was decommissioned. And this font was moved to St. Andrews at that time. And this font was used to baptize children who had been abandoned on the street. And this was the world's first charity, actually, the Foundling Hospital. So these children, nameless, were given new names and a new start to life. So clearing away those layers of clutter revealed powerful moments of meaning and connects us to both the cultural and the natural history of that site at the top of a hill in Holborn. Adding completely new layers of meaning is, to me, also a regenerative act. We developed this sculptural chapel with its reredos in brass, about 9 foot high, inspired by various themes. Maria Stella Maris, or Mary, Star of the Sea. St. Andrew with his nets, Christopher Wren's interest in astronomy, and various other meanings that we try to embed, not to share, so maybe somebody someday will decipher. The old War Office is the next project that I want to share. It had a barren courtyard. The architecture was designed to create an imposing imperial identity, and it was Ministry of Defense until we were asked to intervene in 2017. And we were asked to transform this space of authority and kind of imperial rigor and colonialism into a space of hospitality and welcome. So we introduced a new sculptural pavilion, a fountain, paving design, essentially public realm, which I desperately need updated photos because we have beautiful trees and plants and flowers growing and planters all throughout. It's not a great look for our regenerative conference, so I've still got the opening images. But because the cobbles in this courtyard were original to Winston Churchill's time as Minister of War, they couldn't be removed. Historic England loved our organic designs for the pavilion and fountain and suggested, could we not develop a new pattern for the old stones? And this was the result. Integrating a fountain, a pavilion, and a paving pattern into a single organic whole. So the idea of bringing fluidity, inspiration from nature into a space that had originally been meant primarily for war, all tied together. So biophilic design really cascades from the fountain to the architecture of the pavilion and really to the interior of its columns and its ceiling. So again, there are combinations of connecting with history, bringing in inspiration from nature, and aiming to bring new layers of meaning into old spaces. So the third project, on a larger scale, we've been working at the border between Cambodia and Thailand, where from the late 1970s until the late 1990s, the Khmer Rouge continued to fight a guerrilla war against the government and persisted in perpetrating acts of violence, both to people and to the landscape. This is a military contested area, so if you're wondering where it is that they're talking about when you read these articles about Thailand and Cambodia fighting, it's here. And it's, yeah, as in many conflicts, it's a very beautiful place. But really a lot of important cultural conflicts happening there, not just now, but over the last 20 years. 85% of the people who live in this place are ex-Khmer Rouge. This is where they escaped to, and there was a fragile peace that was brokered in the late 1990s between the government to allow these people to stay there. And those people, due to their ideology of agrarian-only economy, essentially slash and burn the entire landscape that was there. So the beautiful kind of pastoral image on the top left is the Khmer Rouge's version of kind of total monoculture that has replaced a really thriving ecosystem, jungle ecosystem. And due to the fighting and the persistent use of landmines, 25% of this population is actually disabled as of the latest studies undertaken by our client, who began a process of aiming to transform some of these sites of violence, such as Pol Pot's house, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, which has now been transformed into the An Nong Veng Peace Center, where there are programs happening for education and training. We also have 14 different sites where different kinds of cultural violence or physical violence to people had happened. And so, for example, we're taking areas where, maybe I'll show here, where a lake was created using forced labor, as you see on the top right, and an idea of turning that into a site where it could be used for worker center and vocational training, or the actual grave site of Pol Pot, the leader, idea to transform into a place where people can learn from the history. So these are kind of the ideas that we have there. The concept, working with master planning-wise, taking these 14 sites where different moments of violence or history had happened in these orange dots that you see on the left, connecting them, working together with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Tourism to create a regenerative heritage corridor. So visitors on that journey can participate in reforesting and rewilding this linear path. And the ultimate aim is for the linear reforestation project to perform a new armature for urban development. So capturing the historical sites and protecting them, providing natural infrastructure for the new residents, all while using a minimal amount of developed land because there's a huge amount of development pressure on this site, at least until the war started. So what you see here on the left is the artist's impression that we've made is not old growth forest, but it's an aspiration towards rewilding. It's not actually a natural stream that we're talking about, but large-scale water infrastructure that can be used to manage climate-induced erosion and weather effects. The idea ultimately that it would be possible to heal society and heal the landscape together is the principle at that larger scale. It's a complex, arduous process working at this scale and continues with 2 steps forward and 4 steps back and has been going on for many years. But the idea is ultimately that, as I said, we can find a way to link this healing of landscape and nature together with linking and healing society. So finally, we continue to search for projects at this intersection with Jamie Miller, working with Italia 10 in Canada. We've started preliminary conversations with First Nation groups there, where the government is investing in compensation and support for these people who have been in many ways marginalized. And there is, so really we're thinking that for cultures whose basic philosophy has always been to live in harmony with nature, design inspired by nature and finding meaning through nature's forms might have a special resonance. And so these very nascent conversations just starting literally now, and we'd love to have a chance to talk to more of you about collaboration, because particularly for practitioners like me, where it's very much about doing our best to build and to develop, I think it's always has to go through partnership, really. In the longest term, I would love to find a way to bring ecologically and culturally regenerative design approaches to the rebuilding of North Korea when it opens someday. So all of these things, the question about culture, ecology, and society and development all coming together is something that seems very important to me. I guess I'll just say a couple of closing remarks to summarize on this slide. So first of all, thank you to Marcella Ucci for her support over the last 10 years, beginning with those biophilia projects in the Shard that you saw at the very beginning. I sit squarely at the practical and construction end of the architectural spectrum, but recognize that building beautifully is not enough. So when my studio uses our phrase, beauty built with wisdom, that aspect of wisdom that we aspire to needs a more rigorous and stronger framing. That's, I guess, why I'm really excited to participate here today. Hopefully everybody here is, it's always good to be the least intellectually rigorous person in the room, I suppose, because you have the most to learn. So my question really for the panelists and for the audience is, can meaning be a currency in the new regenerative economy? So for the past 10 years, I've been writing open letters to the next generation, since I started the studio, addressed to my unborn grandchild. So when writing these letters and when thinking about the significance of the Old War Office or St. Andrews or On Long Vang, I explore the ideas of embodied meaning in this regenerative architecture. My work is inspired by nature and its forms, but ultimately the celebration of meaning to human beings is what I find most beautiful. And I've often said that if we care about something, we will care for it. So if our world is suffering under the weight of disposable lifestyles and single-use everything Could a greater emphasis on meaning, on care, show us another path of healing? A path where we bring new life to existing places and where lighter touch, fewer resources, less waste, and longer lifespan characterize our built environment. So the next step for me, I think, is to understand how we measure these impacts and ultimately scale them. And that's it from me. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much, Dewa. Talking about history and culture and memory, adding another thing to the pot for the discussion. I think we have a lot to discuss today. So I'd like to invite the speakers. Yeah, sorry, Malina has to leave. So thank you very much, Malina, for being here with us. So I'd like to invite the other speakers, please, to join the panel. Marcella, do you want to join us? No? Okay. And I'd like to start the next phase of this event, which is the Q&A and panel. I'll go first, if you don't mind, with my first question. And I'll just kind of hit the nail on the head and ask you guys, how do you think it's important at all or how important it is that we have one clear, agreed framework when we talk about regenerative design? I don't know who wants to start, but so I hope the question is clear. Is it important, and if so, how do we get there?
I can get it wrong, and you can correct me. I guess, on one hand, you want a meta-narrative that people can know what it is, because I think if you say it's anything goes, then you don't really. There's no discernment. And then you have fragmentation, and it's very hard to get people cohesively behind a certain thing. But I do believe, by its nature, it is entirely and infinitely complex. So the danger of meta-narrative as a kind of unifying factor is to oversimplify. And I guess then you rely on things that people can read and understand in like 10 seconds. And for me, regenerative design would be moving beyond that kind of simplicity. So my answer personally would be, I understand it as a rallying call, and undoubtedly things like circular economy and sustainability have helped. But I'm not sure they've helped maybe in as great a way as we believe they have, because they've also created some terrible behaviours that are done under the badge of sustainability. So all I would say is, let's not repeat some of those mistakes by losing complexity.
Sure. I mean, I definitely agree with what Brenda's saying. I think it's, and this is one of the things we struggled with the primer, is you need to be able to reach a wide audience because we're all in this together, but at the same time, we don't all speak the same language, because every discipline has its own language, and as I was pointing out, everybody has their own agenda, we can say. So I think I'm really just going to be reinforcing what was said or repeating it, not very imaginatively, but that we have to find a way. If we've got this top tier, which is that big framework, and I thought it was interesting. I'm aware of the work, obviously, that Foresight was doing, that Malina presented, but, and separate to that, what was done at Architects Declare, actually the three headings are essentially the same, whether it's nature-led or co-create with nature, or systemic, which is be a good ancestor, or equitable, just space for people. It's just slightly, try to take something and make it a slightly more accessible language, if you like. But what we need are champions who come from different backgrounds that can help it all trickle down, and, as I said before, a way for it to land, because what you do in a master plan that might be regenerative, and I think that, David's work was really illustrating it. What he does at the building scale is going to be different from what he does at a master planning scale. It has to be. But you have to understand what regenerative means at those different scales, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a need to put some weight behind the claim that something's regenerative. Like, we don't want to end up with a greenwash project, but there's, I think, a gentle balance in overdoing it as well. And I think when you start looking at, actual frameworks, and you don't want something that's going to end up looking like the sustainability, frameworks that we already have and becomes a replacement for that. So, yeah, I think I don't have an answer, but yeah, I think there does need to be a little bit more kind of, technical weight in terms of actually measuring regenerative design in some capacity, but at the same time not, repeating some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. And I think really making sure that it's place-based too. That's one of the messages that I think is reflected in kind of many of the approaches around regenerative design, and figuring out a way to make sure that's carried forward. So you're doing what's best for the place in a very local kind of context.
Thanks. I really agree that every discipline will have its own language, and that we need to be sure that we can all be contributing in our own way. But I think it was really helpful to me to see these. I saw two systems. There was one is be more good to the outside, and there was be less bad to come back inside the planetary boundaries. But the main themes all seem to be very clear. There were questions about water. There were questions about biodiversity or biomass. I think there are questions about very clear planetary limitations and boundaries that we need to be addressing. And I guess every project needs to be pushing in those directions if we want to make a collective move forward. What I would love to see is a bigger understanding in the design and construction industry about what communicates to the primary movers. So what communicates to the governments, what communicates to the banks, and ultimately what communicates to the largest deployers of capital. I noticed that Justin just left, but the last conference at the Design Museum, there was one of the chief sustainability officer of Standard Chartered Bank was there talking about how they've just funded a flood barrier in southeast of America, where they spent $1 billion extra on it to make it resilient for a 150-year flood rather than a 50-year flood, because otherwise that asset would just be completely washed away in 15 years. And so I guess for me that's one of my big questions is what are those languages? How do we, as people who are all very technically involved, actually begin to leverage those people who have the real moving power? That might be the most important thing.
Yeah, great. So moving forward on that respect, and reflecting on what Emily said to kind of try and avoid greenwash. So how do you think we should approach this kind of framing of regenerative design? Is it something you believe needs to be kind of bottom up through kind of independent initiatives like Architect Declare, or something more commercially oriented, LEEDs, BREEAM, these kind of things, or maybe governmental interventions? What do you think? How should we go about to kind of frame this term?
I think it probably needs many different levers, and I think anything that's going to cause kind of large-scale systemic change requires policy and requires industry and kind of the industry-based collaborative groups to really kind of move the bar. So.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I always think of that phrase, which is well worn at this point, of think globally, act locally. And I think, as Emily's saying, I think it has to be, top down, or maybe the down part we don't need, but it has to come from on high. This is why we struggle with things like targets, but, and as I said when I was speaking earlier, government sets regulatory targets, but sometimes I feel like they backfire because they squash ambition, because they, I'm going to tick the box, so I just need to do the lowest. we haven't quite figured out how to inspire. But I have noticed, there are lots of, globally, I think, there's two things locally. One is, there are sort of in many indigenous communities, there are things happening locally that are regenerative, but that's just the way things have always been done. I think it's interesting, you're working in my home country with First Nations people. There is the regeneration was kind of beaten out of people at a certain point. But then I also see, encouragingly, people doing things in their local communities which are regenerative. Partially, this is going to sound really good downer. The world's not a great place right now, but we can't solve all the problems. So you figure, you know what? I'm going to just focus on what's at my doorstep, and that might mean that I'm doing something, with the landscape that I can see and that my community can enjoy, because I really, I can't solve the world's problems right now.
One part of me is entirely impatient. I don't think I can wait for someone to make a policy. I think I have to get on with it because I just can't be bothered, hanging around in the fringes waiting for it all to unfold in front of me. It's interesting what you were saying about sort of the race to the bottom. I think things that were very well intentioned, like biodiversity net gain, have become actually used in very sort of sad ways. I think we can think of a lot of projects not too far away from here that have, used it to make some rather sort of ill-considered decisions because they score well. And so I live in Camden, and actually there's a lot of redevelopment happening there in the area of old, like Sidney Cook's Camden, which was, I think, an entirely visionary development, back at its time in the 60s and 70s. Has its flaws, of course, but it was built around this idea of community and sort of shared space. And what they're proposing adjacent to it is this entirely high density, entirely economically driven model. And I feel like it's very hard to protest against something like that because the argument that they make is so compelling. It's about a certain number of houses, whatever. But I feel there's a real failure, I think this is what you were alluding to, of imagination within developers or within local government, because these people are simply unaware. So when you turn up to meetings and say, how do you know what the 10 most interesting sustainable buildings look like in Europe? Everyone looks at you like you have horns, like why would we do that? And so there's no intellectual benchmark outside of a certain circle of people. So I do believe that this isn't something for one-off and bespoke projects. It should be something that's very much democratic if it's going to have any scale. But the gatekeepers, I think, which is what you were alluding to, are largely unaware. So if that needs a blunter implement to try and achieve that, maybe policy then has to be the way to go.
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of things. Kathryn, I guess, voted with her feet. She's with Architects Declare. On my side, we're a member of the Regenerative Architecture Index, and I think that this idea of bridging from activism to industry to government is very interesting, because we're also a signatory to Architects Declare, but always see this as something that is far more activist from our side, and by nature it has to be very, you have to make very strong statements that are very difficult to achieve. And I think this idea about having a bridge through, say, architecture today, which is a kind of more classic, I guess, industry is always working towards PR and finding a way to promote work and promote their good practice. I think it becomes a bridge that may make it easier than another step from there to government or from there to sort of less educated developer, I think might be good. For me, I think terminology is extremely important. So I've been waiting for this ever since I read Cradle to Cradle the first time, where I think there was always this thing like we shouldn't be telling our friends that we're cooking a slightly less poisonous or nearly non-poisonous meal for them. We really should be saying we're making healthy meals, and I think that for me that was 10 years ago, and I think has, or 15 even, and I think human beings are much more motivated by positive ideas than by negative ideas. And so you see examples, for example, in the Chinese transition to EV and PV-led energy infrastructure recently, or more longer ago when somebody just said, well, let's just go to the moon in 1969. I mean, it seems completely insane, but people will find a way to do it, and I think finding the right goals that are simple enough for people who have to deal with large groups of people to engage with seems really important. So sustainability always felt like, okay, let's all get really excited about kind of barely surviving. You know, it's sort of like the idea, which is what the word sustain means. I think this idea of regeneration or flourishing seems like something that you could get people really excited about. So, yeah, so I think for me it's important.
Thank you. I've got plenty more questions, but I'd like to open it for the...
Yes, I think you should. In fact, may I suggest maybe we can take a round of 2 or 3 questions, and then the panelists can answer so that we get more questions in. But my question was, you know, in a university we do a number of things. One is research. The other one is train the next generation of, in our case, often it's architects, engineers, built environment professionals. So bearing in mind what I've heard about, it's a mindset, first of all, but also it's a technical set of skills. What are your thoughts about how should we change the mindset of our current and future students so they think regenerative? Are there any particular things that you think of? Are there any particular skills that, you know, as I was listening to Brenda, you know, I trained as an architect. I have no idea about plants. I've never studied them, right? So that was my question. Thank you.
Take another question? Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Joanna Wilson. I'm actually industry, so I'm a sustainability lead at a 100-person practice, Fletcher Priest Architects. So I guess the challenge I have is trying to promote people to, you know, think in these more ambitious ways, but understand where the bridge is between, as you say, where people are now and where they are in the future. And what I see quite a lot in the industry is this risk of greenwashing that you see so much, because the boundaries just aren't defined. Who are we being regenerative for? Is it the people that are using the building in the site, in the community, or is it the people who are digging the materials out of the ground? And do we risk, are we just, you know, are we going to have to keep making up new words to kind of compensate for the fact that we've kind of dimmed down the word we used before?
Anyone want to take those questions?
Well, Monica, you would, not everybody may know, but I run an MSc in biointegrated design. And we started this as an independent master's because we were teaching the MArch students on the AD program, the one-year program, some biology, and we always called it flirting with biology because it would ultimately end up in a scientist usually having doing the hard work and then giving the architect a flask of something or a plant. And we thought, isn't that a great shame, actually? We're not empowering people to do this for themselves. And I think, especially around materials and new materials, I think if you don't have a sensibility for the thing that you're working with, you're never going to design with it. And that material empathy, as well as the technical understanding, is really what led us to create this program. It's the most ridiculous master's at UCL. It's 300 credits. It's 19 months. Still recruiting for 2026, by the way. But our graduates, we created 2 streams, one for MSCs, so scientists who wanted to design, because that door closes for you, actually. Once you've decided to do science, the world of design doesn't exist. And then for those who did architecture or the design backgrounds who wanted to actually engage with biology in a meaningful way, it's really hard. It's a really hard program. I mean, the students do, I mean, I don't even know if I would pass my own program. It's a pretty, it's a tough gig, but I don't know, I think I'd probably fail computational design, I imagine. But the journey that they go on and the critical thinking they acquire is really necessary. And I think at an institutional level, having support for this really radical type of interdisciplinarity is important. And I really look forward to my next generation of students coming out and seeing what they're doing. And I think maybe I'm not super well equipped to answer Joanna's question, but I suppose part of, for us anyway, is what we think about in terms of regenerative design around this idea of relationality, that, you know, you take the material from the quarry, but the quarry still exists, and that has to be as much part of it. Now, who can hold all of that in their minds? I think that becomes the challenge, because, you know, the client certainly can't, you know, you'll explode someone. If I go to B&Q and I try and buy a piece of timber, you know, I need them to choice edit for me. You know, I can't possibly do that amount of research while I'm standing there. But nonetheless, I think, for me anyway, that is very much part of it. But how we define those boundaries maybe requires a bit of a shift. I think this is what Monica was alluding to, and how people are trained, actually, so that they're more aware of this beforehand.
Yeah, I just was thinking about stewardship and kind of the concept of being a good ancestor. And when you think about what you're designing, you know, thinking about it also with that kind of perspective in mind, and thinking about how it will be used on the project longer term. And I guess one of the kind of tenets of regenerative design is that the project, you know, doesn't end when it ends, but that's kind of the beginning of the project in a sense. So I think, you know, within each discipline that works on a project, really thinking about where that stewardship is going to come in, and how that kind of long-term use of the project will come into play.
I think for me, I guess when you're really trying to build, the larger the things that you're trying to build, and the more you're really physically trying to do them, I think the work face becomes almost infinite. You know, I mean, there's so many aspects, as you say, that you have to juggle just to get anything built at all, that it is quite overwhelming. And I think for me, maybe the searching for simplification and simplicity and coming down as much as you can to really basic terms, values that you can articulate that are within your control. I'll just give you an example. Our very first project, 11 years ago, in Korea, it was a recladding and a regeneration of an existing office building that needed a new facade because there was no insulation. It was all single glazing. And I arrived in Korea, it was my first project, and they said, well, we almost have not enough money to use any different cladding material, but we might just be able to use this aluminum sandwich panel with plastic in between. And I remember thinking, this was before Grenfell Tower or any of this had been revealed, but I remember thinking, yeah, I don't think I want my first project to be plastic. You know, that doesn't quite sound like the aspiration that I had. And it was like a very quick litmus test that would be something easy. I said, there must be something else that we can do. And they said, oh, well, stone, like China is very nearby, so stone is super cheap. Like, that's much cheaper. So, okay, well, we'll go for a stone, right? But I think that there are a lot of things that complicate our lives as designers, and there are very simple questions that appeal to our basic humanity. That, do I really want to be designing something that really I don't think is going to last, and I look at it in 10 years it's going to look terrible? I would say, as a designer, if I'm working at an office of 100 people, it's a really easy place to begin. Or whether we say, let's genuinely show interest in the nature that exists on that site and see if we can enhance it. I suppose finding those very simple stories, maybe some anchor that you can have with the whirlwind kind of all around you, I would say.
I feel your pain. I mean, this is why we spend time thinking about what drives people, our clients, and it is a challenge, and I won't claim to have cracked it at all. I certainly know, working at the urban scale, maybe it's a bit naughty, but it's because, you know, there's two things at work. One is this kind of gut reaction, oh, it's going to cost more to do the right thing. And so we're constantly proving, well, no, it's not going to cost more. But the other thing is, and this is, you know, maybe a bit, it's not naughty, but it's sort of saying, well, appealing on a very personal level, like, what do you want your children to inherit? It's like you writing letters to your yet-to-be-born grandchildren, I guess. But, you know, we already see it, like what we enjoyed is not what, you know, our kids can enjoy now in the world. And so maybe one has to somehow find ways to talk to clients that way as well. I know I'm making it sound way simpler than I know what you're struggling with, so sorry about that. And then I guess in terms of training, I mean, I think I want to enroll in your program. I would definitely tell them I would definitely want to go. But I think it's this interdisciplinary approach. It cannot be in our silos. It's both good in terms of understanding, you know, different perspectives while you're still in a position to be testing solutions, but it also means you come out with a broader language. I always tell this story because way back I was teaching in the cities program at the LSE, and a geographer, some of you may have heard of, Ed Soja, would come into our class as a guest. He was a visiting fellow, and I remember sitting around, and in the class, half of the students came from architecture backgrounds, and half of them came from a mix of other disciplines. It could be, you know, international relations, anthropology, economics, whatever. And one student started going, we were having a discussion, I guess, about a project that I was setting, and this one student who was an architect by background kind of went off on a long kind of diatribe and you know, spoke a blue streak for, you know, a good, whatever, 5-10 minutes. And then Ed Soja, who of course, you know, was a professor at that point, just looked and said, I haven't understood a word you said. And I saw the non-architect 50% go, phew. You know, like, that, I thought I was really stupid for a minute there. Anyway, so, you know, it's just like, even at that microcosm, if everybody can be speaking the same language, we're going to be so much further along in solving and, you know, tackling issues.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe a couple more questions before we, yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. I'm interested in the impact of the time frame of development and design. Taking a couple of David's examples, maybe something on the scale of this master plan here. You said it's a long project. Does that create more opportunity for a regenerative mindset to be discovered? Because you don't have to have the answers straight away, or maybe in this case that they were there at the start. And I thought about your church project, the discovery of the spring. You know, if you didn't know it was there, does that change your design? You know, so I'm interested in that, and whether perhaps the other panelists, do you have examples of places where regenerative preparation, planning for regenerative preparation as a resource to the built environment is being done, like pre-preparation by, say, local planning authorities or something, so that they have, so that developers have more knowledge of how to engage at a community level, let's say.
Thank you, and I think we'll take another question. Sorry, I think there was another question here.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
There's... sorry? Iris Aquilina, I'm a retired civil servant, so I can tell you about government and why they don't understand. My view is that there's been a recent spate of community housing projects in the UK, because people are interested, like you were saying, in actually having a space that they... But the planners really haven't reached the point, so they're finding it very hard to actually get all these projects out of the way. However, a first project that I had the joy of giving them the grant, which is in Leeds, which is called the Lilac Project, is being used by the United Nations as an example of community housing. So I do believe that community housing is a way forward, and that government, we'll talk about the UK, the government is split into different departments. And as we're saying, interdisciplinary work is really important, but remember, each department actually has its own budget and works against each other. I can tell you, because I worked in the Department of the Environment, but the Department of Trade and the Department for Lands and the Treasury don't understand some of the things that the Department for the Environment wants to do, and then they create new departments like Net Zero, which people don't understand, and Energy and Climate Change, which obviously is the old hat. So the people in government isn't just like one big, it's like individuals like me in a department trying to do their best, but the actual infrastructure of government isn't regenerative. And the other only thing I wanted to say is regenerative isn't just about architecture and design. There's regenerative agriculture, for example. So that if you want to write a law where you make people think about regeneration, you have to have some sort of understanding of what it means for different disciplines. So that's my very general view.
Thank you. So we had a question and a reflection. So if anyone wants to comment on that.
I guess just to think about the time frame question, and I guess just some of the case study projects that I was looking at, which were a lot in Europe, and they have different, kind of planning requirements. And I think the space was kind of an interesting consideration, and not over kind of planning, communities, but leaving them, space to kind of co-evolve with nature, or giving them that opportunity to have or integrate regenerative, design, I guess, into the future. So I think that those two kind of variables were kind of interesting and work together, and making sure that it's not just completely built up, but that there's space for that organic kind of nature to happen as the projects go on. And I think also, it just really depends how these communities are operated. Are you talking about houses or something where the developer might retain some element of control and can kind of, have some authority or influence over the operation of public realms. So it really can vary, I think,
I think, time is it's very important, and I know we have these classic diagrams that many people know from circular economy kind of 101, where you have the kind of concentric envelope where every 7 years you're redoing your interior of your office, and then every 30 years you're replacing your facade, and everything kind of falls in between. So I think when we talk about urban design, of course, the Romans laid out a lot of the streets that are in London. It's incredibly difficult to move them because ownership boundaries get established, and in our society it's very, very difficult to change that. So the primary responsibility is to get that right as much as possible, because that might be there for 1,000 years. And so I think then you get to some of the more contingent elements, and then you're constantly trying to deal with the changes that seem to be happening faster and faster, I guess, or at least our AI companies are trying to convince us that everything is changing and advancing more rapidly, which I'm sure will be true for a lot of basic fundamental science. So that will be coming. But the Cambodia project, for instance, if you remember, if you go back actually to those 14 points, and then you see a golden thread that links between them, what was interesting about that project, actually it's only like one slide back, I think. On the far right, you see actually those 14 points and then the golden line. Like literally they took that golden line that we had sketched and then just stuck it on the map on the top right and then legalized it. And makes you realize also that this is a place where there is no clear land ownership because it was an area of conflict, essentially. So there was a possibility to do this. But then also the technique that's used for design with that golden thread, it's allowed to shift a little bit to the right or to the left or become a little bit more crinkly or straight as the project gets developed. So I think this concept of maybe it's appropriate to regenerative design because I'm sure Brenda would be the first one to tell us that you never have a fully fixed state, with biological systems or ecological systems. So that's very much what happens as you leave the architectural scale to the urban scale. So I think designing for loose fit in the ceiling heights of your structures, to the way that your facades are designed, the way your ground floors are designed, leading all the way through to how your streets are laid out in your districts. I think that there's something that's really important for us to take there, that there's enough flexibility, and maybe that's going to run contrary to our current economic systems, which are very much about just-in-time logistics, maximum extraction of profit, immediately, and so every loose fit element seems like just those 10 centimeters of ceiling height that we could fit in one more floor in our 24-story tower and therefore return 0.3% more to our investor from Doha. These are the things that are actually driving a lot of these decisions, but that are taking us maybe in the backwards direction. So I think being able to move that time frame, I think is going to need the civil servants probably more than the designers, to be honest. But we need to build those links to push through people who actually want to do that, as they've done in China, right? On some of these elements, they've managed to do that.
Maybe just to add on the subject of time, it's interesting when you develop a new material, just how long it will be and how sort of fraught with danger and risk it will be until it ever maybe sees the light of day. And I think Prantar has spun out a company called Tatva to try and take this biomineralized material through, and I have to admire his courage, because this is going to be a long slog. So I do wonder, coming back to maybe Iris's point on, what are the enablers, and having people who sit between regulatory and policy, who actually understand what is truly needed from a technical standpoint to encourage this kind of innovation would be a massive help, because I feel otherwise we're trying constantly to fit in the wrong category, because it's disruptive. So I think time and the essence of time, and when we think about the COVID pandemic and how rapidly things were able to be rolled out, we do have these mechanisms, we just choose not to use them. And I feel like there will come a turning point where climate change will become so high on the agenda, no longer just the preserve of people like me, who kind of toot along. It will become so economically important to address that we will have no choice but to try and find these mechanisms. But it'd be a shame to wait until then. Could we not do it before?
I'm completely sympathetic to what you're saying. I think, I had the pleasure of working with a group called Human Nature and Periscope in a project in Lewis, and it was a really good example, to be fair, I think they finally get it, of the local authority really not understanding regenerative design or the ambitions of the design that I deeply believe was trying to do the right thing, and thinking about the long term, and thinking about, how the space between the buildings was doing as much work as the buildings, as well as, not only thinking about locally sourced materials and, from building to landscape, etc. Anyway, I won't describe the whole scheme. I think what was really sad about it was the project that had been proposed on that land previously had envisioned an entirely, this is across over 7 hectares, below grade garage, car park. And of course, then they couldn't make that add up. So they abandoned ship, abandoned the project. Whereas what we were proposing was essentially a car-free neighborhood. And that was one of the things, again, that the local authority got really worried about. Well, who's going to want that? Even though it was really actually quite heartening. Loads of local engagement was conducted, and people were and are very enthusiastic about it. But again, the phasing and the fact that things are long, take a long time in a master plan is both good and bad, because yes, you can start to flesh out ideas, our knowledge increases, technology changes, we find new ways to both communicate but also solve problems. But the down and dirty side of it is the investment leaves sometimes. And so that's been a struggle with this project, where the person driving the project is not, Bartlett Homes with deep pockets, but rather, a small group of people who really do want to do the right thing and guess to get investors. Well, investors, they're not necessarily what's called patient capital all the time. So time can work for and against us.
Right, thank you. So speaking of time, I think we are way past our schedule. So firstly, I'd like to thank our great panel. I hope you guys got some answers for your questions. I got some answers. I have more questions than we started, but I hope that's a good thing. I'd like to invite everyone for a reception we have in the other room, and thank you very much.